Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about how non-inertial reference frames are an exception to Newton's first law. Wow, that's a lot of big words. Let's move on to something more understandable. So first off, let's talk about why we care about reference frames anyway. They seem kind of like a pain. Well, let's say you're hanging out in the grass here, and your friend is chilling on a nice merry-go-round. So he's moving at some velocity v. So you tell your friend, hey, you're moving at some velocity v. And he says, well, to me, it looks like you're moving at some velocity v, which is true from his perspective. But from your perspective, he appears to be moving. How can you settle this dispute? Well, you could arm wrestle, you could flip a coin, draw straws, or you could talk about reference frames. From your reference frame, he appears to be moving. But from his reference frame, you appear to be moving. This is somewhat like a compromise in physics. As it turns out, though, reference frames aren't just for settling playground disputes. Let's say we've got a funny-looking red bus here and a funny-looking blue bus here. Red bus moves at velocity v1, and blue bus moves velocity v2 in the opposite direction, so they're approaching each other like this. We'd like the two vans to meet somewhere in the middle, but of course we don't want them to run into each other. It turns out in this case, our reference frame is particularly important. As you might know, reference frames are very important when more than one object and more than one velocity are involved. Let's say we've got Billy Bob the observer right here. To him, he sees velocity v1 and velocity v2. Looks like we're in good shape. What if we've got an observer in the red bus? To him, it looks like the red bus isn't moving because he's inside it. He's got the same velocity as the bus. But it looks like the blue bus is moving at a velocity that accounts for both the velocity of the red bus and the blue bus. So we're still in good shape. But what would happen to us if we said that one reference frame is inside the red bus? This guy here is going to monitor the velocity of the red bus. And this fellow over here will use his reference frame to consider the velocity of his bus, the blue bus. Well, of course, our observer number 1 can't see velocity 1 because he's moving at that velocity. And for our reference frame number 2 with this guy over here, it appears that this velocity doesn't exist either. So, of course, if the buses aren't moving, they'll never run into each other, which we know is false. This can be a big problem. Now our buses look even funnier than they did before. That's a bad time. So obviously, reference frames are very important. So what is this non-inertial reference frame business? It turns out when you're dealing with Newton's first law, you have to pay attention to making sure that all of your reference frames are the same reference frame, and also you have to make sure that your reference frame is not non-inertial. So what does non-inertial mean anyway? This means that your reference frame is accelerating. This is the problem we had with our T-Rex on top of the Ferrari. The Ferrari was decelerating very quickly. If you measure the reference frame when you're considering only the Ferrari, if you consider it as your reference frame, then Newton's first law can't apply because the reference frame is non-inertial. It has an acceleration. Instead, we have to pick an inertial reference frame. This guy over here, who is at rest, is in an inertial reference frame because he is not experiencing any acceleration or deceleration. He must be moving either at a constant velocity or at zero velocity. So inertial reference frames. A handy way to think about these is to remember that funny word inertia we talked about in the last lecture. An inertial reference frame is a reference frame that obeys its inertia. It's moving at a constant velocity or at rest. This means that no forces are acting to move the reference frame itself. The car is not an inertial reference frame because it's experiencing deceleration, so it must be experiencing some kind of force. I hope I've convinced you to appreciate reference frames. If nothing else, just remember to stay away from non-inertial reference frames. Catch you next time!